Right, everyone, if we can begin, and we'll be able to allow people who are coming later to join us. Anyway, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our meeting, Not Welcome Here, where we will explore the proposed Sovereign Borders Bill, which includes the new plan for immigration. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Edie Friedman, and I'm the director of JCORE, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality. The purpose of this meeting is to help us to understand the government's new immigration plan and how we can most effectively oppose their proposals. The concern is that these proposals will fundamentally change our asylum system and at the same time damage public attitude towards people seeking asylum. And to help us navigate through all of this, I'm really delighted to welcome our two guest speakers, Lord Alf Dobbs and Enver Solomon, Chief Executive of the Refugee Council. Lord Alf Dobbs is a Labour politician and leading refugee rights advocate, formerly MP for Baddesley and Director of the Refugee Council. Alf was appointed a Labour peer in 1994, and in 2016, he sponsored an amendment to the Immigration Act to offer unaccompanied refugee children safe passage to Britain. This was later called the Dobbs Amendment. Having himself arrived in Britain in 1939 on the Kindertransport as a 6-year-old refugee fleeing from the Nazis in Czechoslovakia, Alf is now campaigning along safe passage to encourage the government to accept 10,000 unaccompanied refugee children and young people over the next 10 years. Enver Solomon joined the Refugee Council as Chief Executive in December 2020, following 3 years of the CEO of Just for Kids Law, a charity providing youth support and legal representation to children and young people facing adversity. He holds a wealth of experience in the charitable sector, and prior to that, he was a journalist at the BBC for 10 years. He served for 5 years as chair of trustees at the charity Asylum Aid and was a founding director of the think tank British Future. He's an expert in a range of social policy areas, including child protection and child poverty. Enver will be speaking first, and after we hear from Enver and Alf, we will open the floor for questions. Please put your questions in the chat box and make sure that you are muted throughout the event. I hope very much by the end of the evening that everyone will feel more equipped to know what role they can play in helping to counter this new legislation. So over to you, Enver, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Edie. It's wonderful to be here amongst you all this evening. This is an issue which is very personal for me. My mother came here from apartheid South Africa as an Indian South African. My grandfather was a founder of the Indian National Congress, a sister organization of the ANC, and she sought political sanctuary in the 60s in London. My father's family were Jewish refugees that fled from Eastern Europe. So I have refugee genes within me, and it's an issue which really matters to me. And what we're seeing from this government is what we feel at the Refugee Council, and many of those that are campaigning for the rights of refugees, as probably the most draconian attempt to curtail those rights that we've seen for decades. Ironic, really, because this year is the 70th anniversary of the UN Convention that we proudly signed up to in 1951, and it was the year that my organisation, the Refugee Council, was founded. And here we are 7 decades later, where the government has brought forward proposals that will essentially create a two-tier system. A two-tier system that means that if you've come here over land through so-called irregular routes, you are treated differently with different rights and entitlements than those who might come here on a formal settlement program, resettlement program through so-called regular routes. So the most recent big large-scale program has been the Resettle of 20,000 families and people affected by the Syrian conflict. But of course, most people don't have the opportunity to come through a so-called regular route. You know, people don't have the opportunity to go to an embassy, to knock on the door and to be given a visa to find safe passage to our country. Many people, as has been the case for decades, have to take their life into their hands and face dangerous, perilous journeys across land. But this government has now decided that those people are no longer going to be given the right to refugee protection in this country. Indeed, they're saying that if they pass through a so-called safe country, the government will attempt to return them. Even though we don't have any return arrangements to safe countries, and following Brexit, we no longer are able to form any multilateral agreements with EU nations. So how that will be implemented will be extremely challenging and definitely remains to be seen. The fact is, though, that they are deeming those people who, through no fault of their own, have had to take dangerous journeys, they're deeming those as undeserving of refugee protection simply because of the way they've had to find their way to our shores. Now, this is a fundamental shift, and it goes further than that, because today, if any of you have read some of the Sunday newspapers, the Home Secretary's team have been briefing out that, in fact, if you're coming across the Channel and you're intercepted by British authorities whilst you're in the Channel and you're in British waters, so you've entered British waters but you haven't arrived on UK land, then that will be deemed an illegal act and be subject to up to 4 years imprisonment, which takes the level of a punitive response and a draconian response to really another level, a level which I think is deeply alarming given this country's tradition of welcoming people, welcoming my family, no doubt many of your kith and kin in your family. Refugee protection is woven into the fabric of this nation, yet we have a government which is launching a full frontal attack on the rights of those who come here seeking protection. And my organisation, the Refugee Council, has done some analysis to look at the proposals and the numbers affected, and we think at least 10,000 people a year who ordinarily would have been given refugee protection will not under these proposals. There will be up to about 9,000 who could be given a different status, what the government is terming temporary protection. So if you've come here through no fault of your own overland, the rules will say that you're deemed inadmissible if the authorities think that you could have made an application in another country. You'll have 6 months to wait till your application can be processed, and during those 6 months the government will try to return you to another country. As I say, that's going to be very difficult because we have no agreements. At that point, after 6 months, your application will be processed, and if you're deemed to be in need of protection, you'll get a new status. You won't get refugee protection as we know of it today and as we've known on it over the last 7 decades. A status of temporary protection will be granted to you, which will last for 30 months, and a renewal will have to be made every single 30-month period. As I say, this is a step change in our approach to dealing with those who seek our safety, seek our sanctuary, want to come and rebuild their lives here. And on Tuesday this week, we expect this legislation to be introduced to the Commons. The government says that at the same time it's going to expand so-called safe routes, so-called regular routes, but we've seen no evidence yet of the Home Secretary or this government bringing forward any serious, meaningful proposals. Indeed, they haven't even made a commitment to match the Syrian resettlement programme. So whilst on the one hand, they're slamming the door in the face of those who come here, as I say, overland through no fault of their own, and on the other hand, they're doing nothing to expand what they say are the safe routes to enable people to come here, which indeed are safer routes, but unless those safe routes are significantly and ambitiously extended, people will have no choice. And in the majority of cases, people don't have choice. If you're someone who's fleeing persecution from a regime in Africa that deems your sexuality as undesirable and as a consequence you face imprisonment, torture and persecution, you don't have a safe route to come here. You have to come here through a so-called irregular route overland. So from our perspective, this is a critical moment. It's a critical moment in this nation's history, and I urge you all to respond to that moment by having conversations with friends, family, communities, people in your workplace, in your neighborhoods, to make them aware of what these proposals mean. Because on one level, they are quite complicated. On another level, all the public is hearing is the rhetoric and the messaging from this government, which says because people smugglers, so-called people smugglers, traffickers, are in control of these routes where people come overland, their answer is that they have to bear down on these criminals and close down these routes and repel people. And the message that is being sent out is that anyone who comes here through these routes is illegal. The language has changed. We now talk about people who are coming here, fleeing persecution, fleeing oppression, as illegal immigrants. We don't recognize them as human beings seeking our safety, seeking our sanctuary in the way that we have done for many, many generations. Today, the language has been rewritten by this government so that anyone who is seen to be coming across the land, across the channel, or indeed other means into this country is deemed illegal. And the same will apply, friends, to those who come on a plane and land in Heathrow that have not had to come over land, but land at Heathrow. They might not have the official documentation with them. They might have a visa that to their no knowledge of their own expires after a number of weeks, and then make an asylum application. Now, because that application will be out of the rules, they will also be deemed as no longer going through the route that those who have done for decades to make an asylum claim. They again will be deemed inadmissible, and will, if after 6 months they aren't returned, have an opportunity to make an asylum application and recognised as having a need for protection, again will be only given a temporary protection status. So we have to challenge the language, and that was the other request I would make of you, friends. Remind people that those who we see on the news and in the newspapers coming over the channel, these are people who need protection, who need safety. Of course, there might be some who are coming here for economic reasons, who don't meet the threshold for protection. But the point has to be that, as we have done for decades, we need to give them a fair hearing on UK soil. And these proposals that are coming forward in Parliament this week will no longer do that. On top of that, and my final point, is the government is seeking to potentially offshore people and hold them in detention centres outside UK soil where they could be processed. If they don't do that, they are going to create reception centres, which, based on what we've seen in the barracks in Napier and the appalling conditions in some temporary accommodation, in low standard hotel accommodation, this can only be a form of reception centre which doesn't recognise their needs and requirements. So I urge you to have the conversation, to lobby your local MP, to raise awareness of this issue, and to make the case that this country should continue to uphold what I describe as our great British value of refugee protection. Thank you, friends.
Thank you very much, Enver. So, Elf, do share with us your perspective.
Right, well, Edith, thank you very much for inviting me. I always enjoy the lively and good questioning from JCORE audiences, so thank you very much indeed for inviting me. And you will be surprised to know that Enver and I see eye to eye on everything. So in a way, he's covered most of it. So I'll just try and fill in a few of the gaps. The government keeps saying they're trying to deal with traffickers, but there's actually nothing in what they're putting forward that will stop the traffickers. The traffickers will still make money, and the one thing that stops traffickers making money is if there are legal paths to safety, like if there are young people in the Calais area sleeping under tarpaulins, under the trees, and if there is a legal path to safety, the traffickers don't get any business. So it contradicts totally what the government is seeking to do. And one of my serious concerns, I echo Enver, is that there are refugees, but particularly child refugees, who are now stuck in the Calais area, in what's jungle's gone, but they're sleeping off, or maybe on the Greek islands or elsewhere, but particularly on the Greek islands and in northern France. And the government are, as far as I can tell, have nothing there to suggest there is any legal way they can come at all. They've closed that particularly, and that those routes have been closed for some years, but particularly after the 1st of January this year, when the last of the Brexit agreements were given effect to. So it just seems to me we're in a position where people who have been desperate to get to Britain. Why? Well, quite a few of them, and this is the most important and I think emotionally and politically strong case, is family reunion. How can we as a country deny the right to family reunion? There used to be an EU treaty called the Dublin Treaty. You'll be maybe familiar with it. And under that treaty, a refugee child in one EU country could apply to join relatives in another. And we made a desperate effort to get the government to continue to negotiate so that after we left the EU, that arrangement will continue. But they've now closed. It went through both houses of Parliament, and then they eventually, in the 2019 Act, they closed that door. So there is no way. There's no way through at all. And how we can deny family reunion rights, it seems to me one of the most fundamental basic rights that people should be with their family. One of the key things, and we'll talk in a minute about what we can do to how we can put pressure on the government. But going back over the last 5 or 6 years, what has been key has been public opinion. And bluntly, all of you are part of public opinion. And it is public opinion that has had some effect. When I never called it the Dobbs Amendment, by the way, the media did that. I wouldn't call it after myself. I called it Section 67 of the 2016 Immigration Act. However, what happened, and I think it's as well to remember that, is that public opinion woke up to what was happening. And they woke up because they saw these terrible newsreel pictures of dinghies sinking in the Mediterranean, of Alan Kurdi, a little Syrian boy, drowned on a Mediterranean beach. And that made people sit up and they say, we've got to do something to help. And the argument has never been we take everybody. The argument has been specifically that we take some of them. Our share. The Germans have taken far more, but our share. Fairly reasonable request when you consider there are nearly 4 million refugees in Turkey and about 1 million each in Lebanon and Jordan. We're talking about a small contribution that we should make to what is a Europe, well, it's a worldwide challenge, and that's what we should do. So we're not asking really for something other than that we should take small, in relation to the numbers, a small number of people to come to this country. And the government is suggesting that if people don't come, as Enver said, a legal way, it'll be a criminal offence. Well, you know, when people are frightened, when they're escaping persecution, threat of torture, violence, possible death, you know, they're not going to be deterred by this. They're going to try and find safety in whatever way they can. And one of the proposals the government have been putting forward, we'll see when we debate the bill that's being presented to the Commons on Tuesday, is that they'll take people to some distant island. I think they're using the Australian model, where the Australian government have put people onto a distant island, and they're thinking of doing that, or to Rwanda, Central Africa. Well, that is totally unacceptable, that we should dump people in a distant place where they won't have access to lawyers or representation, and their rights will be trampled on. So I think that is one of the other unpleasant features of what the government seem to be doing. We also need to look at the rights of appeal. Quite a large number of the people that have come in the irregular way the government are condemning, quite a large number of people, when they appeal, their right to refugee status is accepted. So even that gives a lie to what the government is seeking to do. Now look, I think one of the ways forward, and it's the opposite of what the government is seeking to do, is to try and have better relations with our EU neighbours, including in particular the French. They're good shouting at the French all the time. The only way to deal with traffickers is to cooperate, a cooperation between the British and French governments, so that together we can tackle the traffickers. But that does depend upon our saying to the French government that we're happy to take, particularly for family reunion purposes, happy to take people to Britain. That way we can have a deal with the French. But at the moment, it just doesn't. The government doesn't seem to be thinking about that at all. I think in order to get public opinion on side, we have to keep reminding people that what our population, what the people who are seeking asylum in this country, what they've been through has been, in many cases, absolutely horrific. I mean, people have been, there was a Syrian boy who said to me, he saw his father blown up in front of him by a bomb in Aleppo or Damascus. But people have had terribly long journeys to try and get to safety. And they've fled from the most appalling circumstances, whether in the Horn of Africa or whether in Syria or Afghanistan. They've fled from terrible situations. And one has to understand that as a way of winning public opinion over by saying these are not people who are just here because they think they can make more money. These are people who are fleeing from the most terrible existence, dangerous, threatening existence. And if we can't be humanitarian, then, you know, we're going against all our traditions and all our background. I was a beneficiary. I was one of the 10,000 children that came on a kinder transport in 38, 39. There were some arguments then, if you look at Hansard, but, you know, Britain gave me safety. And that was a tremendous thing. And I shall always be enormously grateful. Can I just say a bit about, to add to what Emma said about lobbying? Obviously, I think it's important that you approach your MPs on the issues that Enver and I are talking about. You can approach your MPs. And if your MP is sympathetic, it's still nice to pat them on the back and say, thank you for what you're doing and keep on doing it. But above all, it is important to lobby unsympathetic MPs. Otherwise, what happens is that people being human will talk to MPs who are sympathetic, but if their own MP is not sympathetic, they'll leave him or her alone. And that's the wrong thing to do, because it is important that those people who support the legislation the government are bringing forward know that there is pressure against them, know there is public opinion in their constituencies against them, and that helps, might help to sway some of them. At least they'll know the force of the views that unite us and many other people in discussing it tonight. And then local councillors. Talk to local councillors. Local authorities can be key in providing safety, foster families for refugees and so on. And they're also important politically because they have influence on their MPs, or they might have, and on the government. So do talk to your local authorities. And as Emma said, let your voice be heard wherever. I mean, I've spoken to quite a number of synagogues. I should say the first time I went to the jungle in Calais, when the jungle was still there were 12 of us, and we had 5 rabbis in one go. Now, maybe it's commonplace to have 5 rabbis in one go. For me, it was a novel experience. And it showed the commitment of faith groups, particularly the Jewish community, to doing something positive about refugees. And I think that has to be said, and that has to be much appreciated. So please let your voice be heard wherever. Have your synagogue discuss it. If you're a member in business organizations, make sure your voice is heard. A lot of the media are against us at the moment. The Guardian's fine, the Observer's fine, the Daily Mirror's fine, and the Independent. Then we get a bit short of supporters. So let your voice be heard. You are public opinion, and if we're going to stop the government in its tracks, it is thanks to people like you and what you're going to be doing. So good luck to you in your campaigning.
Thank you so much, Enver and Elf, for explaining the difficult situation that we have to counter, but with such clarity. So thank you both very much. Before taking questions and having discussion from our audience, I just wanted to mention how JCORE was responding to this huge challenge. We were involved in helping people deal with the consultation, which the government put out, I think certainly a number of weeks ago, if not a number of months ago, which people did find it a challenge just to understand how to do the consultation. We'll be working very closely with National Campaign as part of the coalition made up of over 250 different organizations called Together with Refugees, because it's really important that our messages coincide with messages from national organizations. We'll be doing the usual letter writing to all Jewish parliamentarians, both in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons. We've produced a communal statement and hope to get endorsement from a large number of communal organizations and individuals to demonstrate the depth of feeling about these issues which exist within the Jewish community. But our biggest challenge is how we inform people precisely about these proposals and their likely repercussions. And it's a challenge of how we keep up the momentum for a campaign that will run over a number of months, certainly well into the autumn. And we hope tonight's meeting is very much a start of that process. And if people would like to be involved in the campaign or would like to contribute financially to the campaign, please email JCORE tonight or tomorrow, and we will certainly be in contact with you. So let me open the floor for questions, and if you could put your questions in the chat box. A number of people have already responded by looking at this rather difficult issue of, does Britain have a proud history of accepting refugees? And we know from the experience of Jewish refugees, it's a very mixed picture, that certainly we had the kinder transport, the United States did not. But we also know that many more refugees could have been given sanctuary here. And we also know about the fallacy of so-called safe countries, because for those Jewish refugees who thought they would flee to safety before the Second World War and ended up in places such as France and Holland, they did not get the safety that they were seeking. So this whole issue about how are we honest about our past without this difficult balance between being critical, overly critical, and recognizing the reality of what we mean by Britain as a welcoming nation. But can we build on some of that, and particularly with all the talk about issues such as British values, how can that play in? So any thoughts, Andrew and Elf, on how we deal with our own history of providing refuge?
Well, shall I, may I say a little? I see one of the lines in the chat box said Britain wasn't very welcoming. Well, it's true. If one reads the parliamentary debates in 1938, at a time when the discussion was taking place about whether to take kinder transport children or not, then there were some very strong arguments against. But in the event, Britain was pretty well the only country that took them, and we took 10,000, and even the Americans said it's additional to quota, and therefore they can't do it. So to that extent, 10,000 in the space of a year wasn't bad in relation to the sort of arguments we're having today. But I think the thing has moved up and down intervals. And sometimes I thought public opinion was more on side. At other times, there were some voices that separated us. And I have to say, whatever you think about Brexit, the Brexit issue certainly polarized opinion and created a more hostile environment towards the other. And we've got to win public opinion back. And we've seen in some European countries where the fascist parties have exploited the refugee issue, and they've done it in a savage and cynical manner, and they've had some electoral successes. Hungary was always like that. Hungary's policy is refugees are not their problem, they're interested in white Christians. But Austria has had the right wing. Italy, we've seen it. In France, we've seen it. In Germany, Angela Merkel was probably lost her job because of it. So when I say it's important we keep public opinion on side, it is precisely because we must not allow the fascism, that sort of extreme right policy. You may argue we've got some of that anyway, well, we can discuss that. But I think we've got to make sure, we've got to make absolutely sure that that we try and keep public opinion on side and realize that there are potential dangers in the way in which extreme right-wing opinion can be used to exploit it. So we've got to deal with that. And I think we've got to appeal to what is essentially still a humanitarian tradition, not everybody. And I believe if the argument is put, then people are, on the whole, more people are sympathetic to refugees, particularly child refugees, than we might think.
Andrew, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I concur with what Alf has said. Look, I don't deny we have a checkered history. I mean, we have a checkered history in response to how we've provided or not provided humanitarian protection and safety to lots of people. But if we take that argument to the public now and say, look, we've been pretty bad at it, and this is just going to make us worse, we have no way of defeating these proposals. You know, we have to articulate a view that is emphasizing key kind of values that people can connect with, and the value of contribution that those who have come here, people seeking asylum that have then gone on and made to their community is critical as part of that. The way that many of those people have been in the front line of the fight against the pandemic in the NHS. I think the fact that this country has not always repelled people, you know, I don't deny that we haven't done anywhere near as well as we should have done, and there's some very dark moments in our history, and the story about how people fleeing the Nazis is a more complicated and mixed picture, and certainly one that we aren't necessarily proud of. But we have to make the argument that as a country, we are a country made up of people who have come here and been given safety and sanctuary. And that is something that we need to continue to do, because if we just retreat into having a debate about whether or not we've actually been as humanitarian as we should have been, it won't, in my view, help counter these proposals. And the public opinion is split. There was some Mori polling done for World Refugee Day. Mori do this polling across a number of countries on every World Refugee Day. And one of the questions asked is should we effectively close our borders to those seeking protection? And I think about 48% say yes and 43% say no. So it's about a 4 or 5% difference. So the public is split on this, and you know, you talk to MPs in Parliament who don't agree with what Alf and I are saying, and many of them say, well, you know, they get a postbag full from people saying that they're fearful of people coming across the channel. They think we're going to be invaded. They think they're going to take people's jobs. They think they're going to be at the front of the housing queue, etc., etc. And my position with this is that, you know, we know these are myths and inaccuracies, but we have to take on that argument. And there's now increasing evidence from, you know, how you campaign and use strategic communications that you can't just pump out counterfacts. You have to engage in a values-based way, and I think using values really matters here. And is really important. So look, I don't deny that our history is more than checkered and is far from always been welcoming. But I think it's about how we make the case for challenging what are very, very draconian policies, and which are probably, you know, the worst and most harsh and toughest policies that have come down the track. And if they become legislation, they will really be slamming the door in the face of so many people who are seeking safety and sanctuary in this country.
One or two people mentioned about whether Brexit has made the environment more hostile. And of course, we have the hostile environment that obviously applied very much to Windrush, which is in no way sorted out. And one could argue that the hostile environment has, I want to say, slipped over. It's been much more active than that in the way we treat refugees. And this whole argument that the government would say we are responding to the people's priorities. People's priorities, a phrase that we hear more and more. And our challenge of using language, and as Enver said, facts don't necessarily work. They can have the counter. And so how do we change this whole narrative about the people's priorities? How do we take back, if I could use that language? And for those of us from minority communities, that sort of language then negates our own past, doesn't it? And why not only the Jewish community, but other communities ought to be in the forefront of saying this, certainly these measures are not the people's priorities. But what is the strategy for doing that? Because I know that people have been working and looking at how to phrase questions, what language to use in producing leaflets and briefing papers. But how do we get through into a narrative where the people's priorities are about a proud nation, that part of who we are and what makes us so good is the positive way we can treat refugees? And I know this is a very big question, but it's one I think we need to continually try to answer. So Elf, how do we puncture this whole notion of we're just doing the people's priorities?
All, we've got to believe in ourselves, and we've got to believe that what it is we're arguing is the right approach. You know, we've got to believe in ourselves, and that belief itself is infectious, and it'll get picked up. That's one thing. Secondly, you know, we do have the media are particularly hostile at the moment. You know, I'm not sure I see the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, and all these papers being sympathetic, and we just got to take that as a given and still argue against it. And we've simply got to let our voice be heard wherever we can. I think it's very difficult. I think at a local level, one can do a bit more. I think at a local level, where there are local organizations, one can engage with them. And I think quite a lot of this might work well locally, which is why I think it's important to engage local councillors and other local groups, you know, pro-refugee groups and faith groups, to get us all to work together. But there is no easy answer. What do we do in a democracy when the government is trying to pretend or suggest that the weight of opinion goes against the humanitarian view? I think we just got to keep letting our voice be heard. If there was an easy answer, we'd have done it long ago. It is precisely because it is difficult that we have to be absolutely determined. We have to repeat myself, we have to believe in ourselves. We have to believe that our argument is the right one, it's the proper one, it's a humanitarian argument, and we have to keep using it and just not give up, and make it as difficult as possible for politicians who are against us to have their way. And we shall see in the arguments in Parliament. And look, I know I personally think the Lord should be elected, but then that's not where we are at the moment. Nevertheless, having said that, it comes to something rather sad when you think that it's the unelected House that may well represent humanitarian values better than the elected House. You know, if we're going to defeat the government, hopefully the Commons will defeat the government on a number of aspects of the bill, but don't hold your breath. And so we'll have to do our best in the Lords to defeat them and use the power of the unelected House. It turns democracy on its head, but we've got to use all the methods that are open to us. I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer, but it's what I believe.
Enver, did you want to add anything at this point before we move on to the next?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things here. I think it's important to recognise that people objectively are fearful when they see images of boats coming across the channel, but actually when they meet and get to know refugees in their communities and understand them as fellow human beings who suffered greatly, then they are very supportive of them, and they will even campaign to make their lives better, and they will do, you know, great acts of kindness will come forward. So it's important to recognise that and understand, I think, what's driving the fear and the anxiety, and try to acknowledge that and connect with that, I think. I mean, I think the other thing that is currently particularly challenging for the ruling government at the moment, and the Conservative Party, is a perception that they're veering towards becoming the nasty party again. If you've seen what's been happening on the debate about overseas aid and the proportionate of government spend that's given to that, there's been a big backbench revolt, and I think there's an increasing anxiety that the public think they're on the wrong side on that, that they're not taking a humanitarian stand. And I think there's something that on the issue we're talking about today, we can really exploit that, because, you know, I think people recognize that that this country should be extending a hand of support and giving opportunity for people to rebuild their lives who need to be welcomed into our communities and need to be given support and a place of safety. And particularly that notion of safety really resonates with the public too, we've found as well.
A number of people did raise about whether this could be, if we could do campaigning across different faith communities, and certainly JCORE would be more than happy to be a part of that, because I think we need to speak to people across faiths and people of no faith as well. But that there was, you know, there are particular arguments that we could have within faith communities, and I'm sure a number of them are engaged, and we will be contacting refugees together to find out the current status of that. Other people have mentioned about the House of Lords, and certainly, as I mentioned before, we'll be writing to all Jewish members of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And also we have a little exercise where we have 10 rabbis, 5 in London and 5 outside London, who we will be asking to write to their own MP, because MPs do respond if it's a constituent who writes to them. So we will be doing that, and we will make sure that we're properly briefed, because obviously the government has worked out its own responses to our particular concerns. I know a number of people have had a long relationship with the MP in Golders Green and Finchley, Freer, who some people feel does get frustrated by how many times he is contacted by members of the Jewish community, including rabbis, and is very aware of things that if he gets 100 letters, he will feel that it's really one letter, but you've got 100 people to send it in. So we really need to think of different ways that we can get our message across, and just knowing that no matter how much we try, these sort of stock answers will be given to us time and time again. So we're certainly not giving up. But how, Enver and Alf, this is going to be a long campaign. I don't know how it compares to other campaigns, but it's coming to the Commons on Tuesday. People are talking about whether we'll have public demos, and of course that's a difficult issue still in the middle of the pandemic. Whether it's decreasing a bit or not, it is still a big issue about whether people will be able to have face-to-face meetings with their MPs as well as join demos. But given that this campaigning will be going on through the autumn, how do we keep up people's momentum and get them engaged in what in some ways are very complicated issues, but in other ways are really very basic issues of common humanitarian sentiment that everyone should be able to appreciate? But how do we keep up that momentum through the summer and into the autumn, whether it will go through the winter as well? What can we do?
Edie, there's a new broad-based coalition called Together with Refugees, and I urge friends on with us tonight to look that up. It's been set up by a number of core organisations, including Refugee Council, British Red Cross, Freedom from Torture, Refugee Action, and it's now received engagement from over 250 community-based organisations, and there'll be through that campaign and that movement building, there'll be community activity and taking place. So I urge people to look at that and engage with it. I think it's also important to, I saw some of the messages in the chat there, particularly to think about those Conservative MPs who have been supportive of the aid issue and might be receptive to the issue. I met with Stephen Crabb recently. He's a former Welsh Minister, former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, who was very receptive to this argument. Actually, there's also some peers in the House of Lords, Conservative peers that Alf and I have been talking to, who I think are receptive. So I think that there are, some opportunities there. I'm not denying that it's going to be difficult and challenging, but I think another one of the key arguments and the evidence from the polling and the work others have done around how to win the public argument is that people want a system that is fair. They want a system that is efficient and effective. And actually that concept of fairness is really important. But equally, at the moment we have a system where there are more than 50,000 people who have been waiting more than 6 months for a decision. We published an analysis on Friday last week that showed that the numbers waiting for more than a year have increased more than tenfold, almost tenfold in the last decade. Today we have hundreds of men, women and children even waiting over 5 years. So to make the point that what the proposals the government is bringing forward will actually make the system more unfair, more inefficient, lead to longer delay, I think is an important point as well.
Could I just say, if I may, Edie, agreeing with all that, look, I'm looking at the chat box, and people are commenting that Mike Freer is not very positive. If you get an unhelpful reply from your MP, can you feed it through by Edie to Enver and to me, and we'll see if we can get the statistics which will refute the ones the government are using. I know what the government is saying, but the fact is there are many other countries that are doing better than Britain. There are countries that are, as I say, Hungary, Poland, and so on. They're worse than we are, but we could be doing better, and that is the argument. Not to take everybody, I repeat, but to take our share of the refugees, particularly in Europe. So if you're having difficulties, can you let us know what they're saying, so that if necessary, if we're able to refute the arguments or their statistics, we would be helpful. The other point is on timing. Look, the bill is being given to the Commons on Tuesday, and it is likely that the second reading in the Commons will take place before the third week in July, when the summer recess begins. So then it will go into committee stage in the Commons, presumably in a couple of weeks when we're back in September, and then again, if necessary, into October. So that I think it will be nearer the end of the year when it'll get to the Lords. Now the timing is difficult. I can't predict that. The government have powers to truncate the time given to debates in the Commons. They can't do that in the Lords. But certainly we're talking about pretty tough arguments in the autumn of this year, as well as, of course, influencing MPs in the second reading debates in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I think we need to be on our toes to see what is happening, to watch what the government's arguments are, so that when the bill, if unamended, gets to the Lords, I hope we will have at our fingertips all the key arguments with which to refute what the government ministers will be saying. And I think we have to look at it that way. It may be it'll become law by December. It may not be until early next year. I just can't predict that at the moment. Depends on other legislation, how much other pressure there is. but certainly we've got to keep on our toes, and it's going to be a very tough year on this particular issue. It doesn't mean we stop it when the bill goes through. There'll be other things we've got to do, but hopefully there are one or two votes that will win in the Lords that have to go back to Commons, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, it's all putting pressure on the government, and that's why we have to alert public opinion to what it is that's happening, that the public know what it is the government are declining to accept by way of amendments in either House of Parliament.
And just to add, sorry, Enver, JCORE is a member of Refugees Together, and I think spoke at their launch, and we will continue, as I hope other organizations, to work very closely with them, because it's important that we're all having the same message as well. So we will continue to do that. We also know that we have a number of rabbis who would be very happy to sign any letters or to appear on any platforms. So if those opportunities, when those opportunities arise, we will certainly be able to help with that. But it is so. Elf, sorry, did you want to make a comment here? Sorry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, just to say one thing about the Lords. I'm looking at the chat the chat box again. There are two things. One is it's very difficult for an MP to say they're against family reunion. It's such a basic thing. You know, I do think politically it's a powerful argument to use with them. Secondly, again, I'm just taking from the chat box. Look, what we should try and do, and I'll use my contacts elsewhere to see if near the time we can get you a list of members of the Lords who might be worth your while approaching. Because Jewish members of the Lords is one thing, but there are many others who'll be susceptible to approaches from you. And I tell you, it's difficult to know where the Lords are, and it's difficult to know whether they have any geographical base or not. It's all part of the ramshackle system of our second chamber, which is why I repeat, I think we should be elected. But that's a campaign for another day, not at the moment. But I do think we might be able, you know, with my friends in Safe Passage and Refugee Council, might be able to put together an indication of members of the Lords that would be useful to approach. By the way, I would say this, that the Labour Party is pretty solidly behind, and it's not the property of one political party, I hasten to add. It shouldn't be, and it isn't. The Labour Party are pretty good on this. The Lib Dems are pretty good on this. We don't have any SNP in the Lords, but they are in the Commons. And then there are crossbenchers, and they're a particularly interesting bunch, because on the whole, they are, I think, more sympathetic to the cause of refugees than perhaps you might expect. I'm sure they aren't all, but there's some good sympathetic ones among them. And then, of course, there's some Tories. So we could try and help you with identifying ones that would be useful for you to contact. And it doesn't have to be geographically based, in the sense that you can write them at the Lords, and you don't need to know where they live or where their homes are, but they would still get pressure and letters, and that would be a good thing.
And certainly the need to have public messages that are simple, a few words that help the public to understand what is being talked about, and why the need to counter these draconian proposals. So we will continue to both work nationally and locally within the Jewish community. And then I think people did make this important point about the importance of local press. And we know from past research that the local press may engage more with the local press than they do with the national press, let alone those people who engage just with social media. So we will be working with others in terms of developing the social media response to all of this. Any more questions before I ask Elf and Enver to say some closing words? Anyone else who would like to? And apologies if your question was not answered. And And someone is asking for very simple arguments and statistics to work with. So certainly this is something we absolutely have to do, because the arguments can be presented in a too long-winded and too complicated. So we really have to find a way of communicating these things with a few words as well. Any other questions before I ask Enver and Elf to say some concluding thoughts? Right. Enver. Oh, sorry, is there a question? It's Elf, you've gone mute again.
Only pointing to Enver to go first, that's all.
The days when we could see people in real life. Enver, some concluding thoughts from you.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, and I see a question in the chat there about who are the most the best spokespeople on the issue, and it's often those that have lived experience of having come to this country and sought refugee protection, the powerful story, the powerful reality carry greater weight, and can, you know, be a more powerful messenger. Another thought from me, and this might sound a bit far-fetched, but obviously there are some very wealthy donors and influencers around this government and the Conservative Party from the Jewish community, and I think it's important to try and reach some of those and have conversations with them. I think some of them are privately concerned about the current proposals and the legislation and are uneasy about it. So I think it's about trying to reach those who have influence with the key politicians here. We know that the Home Secretary is particularly connected with parts of the Jewish community in this country, and we know that there are some very big donors from the Jewish community. So I think if there's ways to reach them, or to reach people close to them, to have the conversation, I think that could be really significant and really important and really matter. And you know, I don't doubt that this is an uphill struggle, and I think, you know, the government is really worried about particularly what it sees as going on with channel crossings, and the only way it can respond to it, it would seem, is to become more punitive and more tough in any response to it. And I actually think that the government's going to live to regret its pledge that it made almost a year ago to ensure there was no one coming across the channel, because that's just not the reality. And however tough they get, their notion that so-called pull factors really matter, and ensuring all those pull factors are addressed, just, there was research in the Home Office a number of years ago that found that just didn't hold water, you know. And the other point here is one needs to think about the push factors that force people to you know, ordinary people to take extraordinary measures, and focus on that, which is where the link back to the debate about international development and aid is really important too. So seeing it in the round in that context, I think is really important. But it is going to be difficult. But I think it's over the coming months and years, it's going to be important to emphasize how the hostile environment is playing out and what it means for people. No one had any idea about what the Windrush generation were experiencing until it became a very prominent public issue. So I think it's really important to tell the story of how the hostile environment plays out. The fact that people live on £5 a day, the fact that the accommodation they're put in is appalling, the fact that the long waits leads to people having serious mental health problems, self-harming, thoughts of suicide, that the hostile environment is really brutal and cruel. And we've started using the word cruel quite a lot, because I think it plays into this notion that the government is being inhumane and cruel and nasty, and it doesn't want to be, it wants to disassociate itself from being the nasty party. So I think we're in for this for a long haul, but I think that the arguments need to be made. I think the proposals that come forward will be found wanting. They will fail. They'll not succeed in their own ends and aims, and that there will be a new cycle where that will be realised, and there'll be a recognition that there has to be a different response that is far less punitive and draconian and doesn't just obsess with the so-called pull factors. But I think it's going to take time, and I think we have to build the argument and the debate and be patient and persistent and continue to make the case.
Thank you, Enver. Elle,
well, I agree totally with what Emma said. You've really got a double act where we're all echoing each other, which is probably a good thing. So thank you, Emma. Thank you, Emma, for that. I noticed in the chat somebody said, yes, I'm lonely. I say, I'm not lonely. There's an awful lot of support, you know, for what we're talking about. And from the Jewish community, of course, but also generally in the country. There are lots of meetings, lots of organizations, you know, it's not unanimous, of course, but there is quite a lot of support. I don't feel lonely. I feel there's a lot of people who are really quite formidable and who are keen advocates. Just say two little things. One of the things that has humbled and impressed me a great deal, and you may have heard me say this before, Edie, is that when I've gone to Calais or the Greek islands and so on, there are young people, mainly from this country, but not exclusively, who are working with refugees, are young people who've given up a year or two of their lives to work with some of the most vulnerable people in physically and emotionally difficult circumstances. And I think it's a great tribute to this country that we've got so many young people who are willing to do that and who are working, as saying, Calais or on the Greek islands and doing that. So, you know, we mustn't forget that there are a lot of good people, and we owe it to those good people, as well as to the refugees, so we keep at it. And not, as it were, withdraw from passionate activity. There's a little story I occasionally tell, which you may have heard me say before, but there's a plaque off the central lobby in the House of Commons, and that was put up about 22 years ago, when there was a international get-together of kinder transport children. They came from all over the world. It's quite a diaspora. Anyway, and we had a rededication ceremony, and the plaque is a thank you to the people of Britain on behalf of the 10,000 mainly Jewish children who came in 38, 39 from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. And we had a rededication ceremony of that plaque about 2 years ago. And a very short notice, we got the Speaker of the Commons, John Bercow, we got the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chief Rabbi, and we had this little, small corridor rededication ceremony, symbolic of the importance attached to the kinder transport as a gesture and as setting the standard by which we want this country to be judged for the future. So I thought that was, I still remember that moment, and all I had to do was to discuss with decide whether the Chief Rabbi or the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke first, a decision I ducked and let them sort it out. But to be serious, I think it was symbolically important, and these things matter, and spreading the word matters. And one other little story, I was invited some years ago to go to talk to the leader of Barnet Council, a Conservative, by a local rabbi in Finchley. And I said to her, but look, you know, I'm Labour, you know, why would he listen to me? Oh, he will. Anyway, I was very warmly welcomed and we had a really good discussion. I'm told at that time Barnet Council actually responded quite positively. So these things can work across the political divide. And I felt, you know, quite happily justified in having accepted the invitation, although I was a little nervous about it. And I haven't done that very often. There are not many other Tory councils I've gone, but I'm always happy to do that. And as I say, I think we should talk to people. It's amazing, we have more supporters than you think. I'll finish on this. When my amendments were going through Parliament, and I was the government were officially trying to persuade me to withdraw their amendments, including Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary. And there are a number of government ministers who came up to me and said, keep on with your amendment. And I said, but look, You're not supposed to be saying that to me. The government is against my amendment. They said, never mind, keep on with your amendment. So we have more supporters. They don't always surface, but there are some behind the scenes. And I take some comfort from that. And I know that behind the scenes, some government ministers who officially have been not very helpful have actually done the business. So let's not be too depressed. We have more allies, we have more supporters than we think we have. As long as we go on putting the argument in a sensible, objective, and dispassionate, or not dispassionate, in a passionate manner. So look, thank you all for what you're going to do. Thank you for listening to Enver and me. Thank you for inviting us. And all I would say is thank you for the things you're going to be doing in the campaign. I'm grateful for the effort you're going to put into it.
And can we say, whoops, sorry, if we could just stay muted just for another few minutes. If we could say a very warm thank you to both Enver and to Elf for taking us through and helping us to understand these very worrying proposals, and more importantly, what we could do about them. So you've really spurred us on. And thanks to everyone for joining us. If you would like to be involved in the campaign, please do email JCORE tonight or tomorrow. And we will be working tirelessly within the community and across the coalition of different organizations to make sure that we've articulated a positive Jewish voice that is saying that justice must prevail and that public opinion must understand that justice is what we ought to be pursuing at all times. So thank you for coming. And of course, keep well. And do, if you want to be involved in the campaign, do contact admin@jcore.org.uk. If you would like to donate, please do go to our website, www.jcore.org.uk/donate. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and do keep well, and look forward to working with many of you to change these proposals. Thank you and good evening.